previous judging experience? What types of arguments are just the most persuasive to you?
I have more experience with TP, but I've done some LD this tournament. I appreciate Clash and just clear argumentation. And have fun, which sounds like you already are.
6 minutes, if you're ready. Our judge? All right, let's get started. I've often wondered what the purpose of learning the area of a trapezoid is. I've asked my mom the question, and she doesn't really seem to know the answer either. Well, within the scope of this resolution, I think I've solved it. Resolved, the acquisition of knowledge is an intrinsic good. That's a lot of big words, so I'm going to go define them one by one. My first definition is acquisition. Again, that's acquisition. Britannica defines acquisition as the act of getting or acquiring something. My second definition is knowledge. Again, that's knowledge. Merriam-Webster defines knowledge as the sum of what is known, the body of truth, information, and principles acquired by humankind. My third definition is intrinsic. Again, that's intrinsic. From Merriam-Webster, belonging to the essential nature or constitution of a thing. And my fourth definition is good. Again, that's good. Oxford Languages defines good as useful, advantageous, or beneficial in effect. I have one resolutional analysis point just to narrow down all the terms in this resolution. That's intrinsic to. Again, that's intrinsic to. What I mean by this is that goodness has to be intrinsic to the acquisition of knowledge, just as a nose is intrinsic to humans, excluding anomalies. A principle or thing has to be intrinsic to something else. That leads me to the value for today's round, which is wisdom. That's wisdom. By the structure of this resolution, I can't give you a value to strive for or that the acquisition of knowledge achieves, because that would make the acquisition of knowledge an instrument or a tool rather than an intrinsic good. Instead, I'll give you a value that proves this resolution true. The acquisition of knowledge is intrinsic to wisdom, and wisdom is an intrinsic good. Cambridge Dictionary defines wisdom as the ability to use your knowledge and experience to make good decisions and judgments. My first contention or major argument for this round is the acquisition of knowledge is good because wisdom is good. That's the acquisition of knowledge is good because wisdom is good. Wisdom requires the acquisition of knowledge. We cannot make good decisions and judgments without the knowledge for them, and we can't have that knowledge without acquiring it. The acquisition of knowledge and wisdom cannot exist without each other. As a component of wisdom, the acquisition of knowledge is an intrinsic good. My application for this is the Socratic method. Again, that's the Socratic method. Socrates developed a comprehensive method to help us become wise. This method connects gaining wisdom directly to the acquisition of knowledge. Moya K. Mason summarizes this philosophy. She writes, "The more we try to learn and internalize, the better our brains seem to get at helping us with the series of actions and reactions that bring us wisdom." My second contention is without acquisition, wisdom dies. Again, that's without acquisition, wisdom dies. Unless we are constantly acquiring knowledge and seeking knowledge, wisdom will fizzle. We have to constantly wish to acquire knowledge, because if we don't, humanity's wisdom will eventually deteriorate. My application for this is anti-intellectualism. Again, that's anti-intellectualism. An article from Words, Wisdom, and Wellness states, "Anti-intellectualism is disbelief, even hostility directed towards knowledge and those who hold it." This has been driven in large part by two new developments in the history of human communication: quantity and access. Vast amounts of information are now available to anyone with an internet connection, which is almost everyone on Earth. Meanwhile, whether by design or accident, our ability to think critically and assess the quality of information we access has declined. Being that its opposite, anti-intellectualism, is intrinsically bad, it follows that the acquisition of knowledge must be intrinsically good. So I hope that you see now that the acquisition of knowledge is indeed an intrinsic good, because it correlates directly to wisdom. Without the acquisition of knowledge, wisdom and the basic ability to make good decisions dies, leaving society in a state of anti-intellectualism. The acquisition of knowledge moves society forward toward wisdom, and it is because I believe this strongly that I would urge you to vote for the affirmative. Thanks. I now stand open for cross-examination.
All right, we got 3 minutes. Ready? Judge ready? Our outstanding audience?
Outstanding.
Outstanding. Joey, can you go ahead and restate your definition of acquisition?
The act of getting or acquiring something.
So it's the act of getting, right?
Sure.
Is there a difference between the act of doing something and the ability to do something?
Sure.
Okay, so it doesn't really matter about so is it your contention that the act of acquiring knowledge is intrinsic to wisdom?
Yes.
And you're saying that's a good thing because wisdom is an intrinsic good?
Yes.
Okay. Can you explain to me how wisdom is intrinsically good, or why do you think wisdom is intrinsically good?
It's commonly accepted by philosophers that it's the ability to discern between right and wrong, the ability to make those good decisions and judgments.
Okay, so is life an intrinsic good?
Sure.
Is life made up of experiences, or right?
I wouldn't say that life itself is made up of experiences.
What is life made up of?
I'm not totally sure. I researched the acquisition of knowledge, not life.
Okay, so can you agree that Lincoln Douglas is a moral debate? We're talking about
Sure.
morality, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So whichever side best upholds the resolution in a moral point of view should win.
I'm not sure about a moral point of view, but I think, yeah, it's my job as the affirmative to uphold the resolution.
All right, thank you. No further questions. Starting 4 minutes of negative prep time. All right, got 7 minutes, Joey. Judge, growing audience, let's go ahead and get started. Now, me and Joey are actually pretty good friends, and over the course of this friendship, we've had some pretty confrontational conversations from time to time. So I've actually become the subject matter expert on proving her wrong, which is why this is actually going to come down to a pretty easy round for me at the end of the day. Now let's go ahead and get into the case and actually explain why that is and prove to you on why she's wrong. Now, she had brought up the definition of acquisition. I just want to go ahead and point out that it's the act of getting or acquiring something. There's no real contention here, but this is going to become real important later on. I didn't disagree with her idea of what knowledge is, but then she brought up 2 different definitions. That's the definition of intrinsic and then the definition of good. Her definition of intrinsic was something that's a fundamental part of something, then her definition of good was something useful. Now, I really have a couple of issues here. And one is she's defining it in 2 separate words. But when we look at the resolution, intrinsic good is used as a term, which is why I'm going to define the whole term here. According to Philosophy Lander, intrinsic good is something worthwhile, not because it leads to something else, but for its own sake alone. In other words, good in itself. And then the second issue I had with this on what she's talking about what good is, well, good isn't just useful. In the Lincoln Douglas debate, this is typically a moral debate. And we don't see the word ought here, where it's indicating moral responsibility. Rather, the moral word in this resolution is the word good. So my counter definition for good specifically, coming from dictionary.com, is morally excellent, virtuous, righteous, or pious. So it doesn't really matter how useful the acquisition of knowledge is. It depends on whether or not it is moral and upholds virtue. And now I'll explain that a little bit more later. Now my first RA point is that of the process. Again, the process. The definition of acquisition refers to the process of gaining knowledge, not the knowledge itself. This process does not inherently possess any moral value, and in some cases can be harmful. The mere act of acquiring knowledge is neutral until its application determines its moral worth. And now, the application, it doesn't matter what the application is. Even if it achieved all the wisdom in the world, that's a great thing, but it doesn't make the acquisition intrinsic good, because, again, the definition of intrinsic good is something worthwhile for its own sake, not because it leads to wisdom or achieves any other intrinsic goods. My next RA point is that of uncorruptible. Again, uncorruptible. This is to help us further understand what intrinsic goods are. For something to be an intrinsic good, that means it has to gain its value 100% from itself with no outside influence. Examples include justice, love, and other certain virtues. One thing all of these have in common is they can do no wrong. Justice, for example, if misused, becomes injustice. Love, if misused to manipulate someone, is no longer actually love. But if you misuse the acquisition of knowledge, or not even misuse it, if you use it in an immoral or bad way, it remains the acquisition of knowledge. I can torture someone to acquire knowledge, and that's still the active process of gaining knowledge. And that's a bad thing, it's immoral. Now it leads to my value of virtue. Again, virtue. Whoever can best uphold virtue, in other words, goodness, will prove that the acquisition of knowledge is an intrinsic good. What is virtue? Well, it's conforming to a standard of right or morality, just so we understand what we're talking about. Now, my first contention is that acquisition can harm virtue. Again, the acquisition can harm virtue. The acquisition of knowledge, as defined, is the process of gaining it. This process has no inherent moral value and can actually harm virtue, which leads to my subpoint of means not valuable within itself. Again, means not valuable within itself. Consider going to the gym. I know you can already tell. I do that daily. But I don't value going to the gym because of how much I love just lifting weights. I actually hate running, I hate lifting weights, but I do it because I value becoming fit, and I do it because I value being healthy. The gym isn't an intrinsic good, the acquisition of knowledge is an intrinsic good. We value it because what it achieves for us. That's the whole point. Now my next subpoint is process can do harm. Again, process can do harm. Even if the knowledge gained through the acquisition is good, the process itself can be harmful, and the acquisition is the process. This can directly undermine virtue. My application to this is the Tuskegee experiments. Again, the Tuskegee experiments. Around 1930, the U.S. Public Health Department promised free medical care for 600 men. What the men weren't told is that they were being used as test subjects to monitor the effects of syphilis. According to History.com, in order to track the disease's full progression, researchers provided no effective care as the men died, went blind, or insane, or experienced other severe health problems due to their untreated syphilis. The doctors deliberately held back treatment in the name of scientific advancement, even though a cure had already come out, and they actually ended up giving several of these people syphilis in order to track it. They did something immoral in order to gain knowledge that was ultimately good knowledge, but the acquisition itself was done in a bad way. It cannot be an intrinsic good, because if it was an intrinsic good, it would have been uncorruptible. My impact to this is process destroys virtue. Again, process destroys virtue. Now I'll go ahead and further prove why I'm the subject matter expert on making Joey look bad. I'm kidding. You're great, Joey. Now, in response to our RA of intrinsic 2, my response to this is misunderstands definitions. Again, misunderstands definitions. The definitions aren't talking about it being intrinsic to anything else. When we look at this in the context of the morality argument, and we look at this in context of defining the whole term like we find it in the resolution, it doesn't matter what it's intrinsic to, it's intrinsic, it's something good within of itself, or virtuous within of itself. Then in response to our value of wisdom, just link this back up to my counter value of virtue. We're not trying to uphold wisdom here, we're trying to uphold virtue. Now, she talked about how wisdom is the ability to make good decisions. I just want to go ahead and draw out a little line here and say, intrinsic goods can have bad components. Again, intrinsic goods can have bad components. So the acquisition of knowledge, or the acquiring knowledge, can be part of wisdom. But it's not the action of acquiring wisdom that's intrinsic to it. It's the principle or the ability to acquire. Ask Joey in cross-examination if there's a difference between an act and an ability. The ability to acquire knowledge is essential for wisdom, but the action of acquiring it, of acquiring any knowledge, isn't. There's going to be some knowledge that's bad and wouldn't benefit us in any way, and we shouldn't acquire it, and we shouldn't try to acquire it. So there's no real link here. It's not the principle of acquiring it; it's the action we're talking about. This gets into response to our second contention: the acquisition of knowledge is good because wisdom is good. My response to this is just, again, flawed framework. Again, a flawed framework. And this goes out, and you can pretty much draw this as a general response to the rest of her case, is the flawed framework. Because unless she can prove to you that intrinsic means that it's intrinsic to something else, then there is no reason, the rest of the framework doesn't uphold. She talked about the anti-intellectualism. Basically, all this was saying is that because not having information is bad, having information must be good. My response to this is some information is bad. Again, some information is bad. Can be bad information, but again, we're not even talking about that. We're talking about the way we acquire it. For these reasons, I urge negative ballot. Thank you. And now it's submit for cross-examination.
All right. I've got 3 minutes.
Yes.
You ready? All right. How do you know love is good?
How do I know love is good? I would say love is good because love is good.
Okay, so you would have me come up here and say, the acquisition of knowledge is good because the acquisition of knowledge is good, and have that be the way that I prove this resolution true.
Well, I would say love is something that is good no matter the circumstances. It can't be corrupted. That's why we know it's a virtue. I want to have love regardless of the circumstance. The acquisition of knowledge, well, it can be corrupted, as I showed in my examples.
Can justice be used to exact revenge?
If it's being used in an unjust manner, it's just that. It's injustice. It's no longer justice.
So let's say the person that murdered your brother goes to jail, and in that sense, that's your way of getting revenge. Is that still, does that make justice, is justice corrupted in that sense? Is it still justice?
Well, the only thing that's being wrong there is human intention. The human intention is wrong, but the justice itself is still pure. The outside factors of what my motives were are separate from the justice itself.
Right, okay. So can an intrinsic good have an extrinsic effect?
I would say it could. If you could give me a specific example, I could give you a better answer though.
So can we determine something's intrinsic goodness based on its extrinsic situations?
Well, as I said earlier, I think the way we're going to determine that is whether or not it can be corrupted and see if it upholds virtue.
So by the end of your speech, you were basically saying that intrinsic goods can be composed of bad things, right?
I'd say that there might be a circumstance where it could be. I would have to research that much further, but that's not even my main point.
Right. So you agreed to my definition of knowledge, right?
I believe so.
And is it good to acquire good things?
Is it good to acquire good things? It's circumstantial. That was my whole point.
Okay, no further questions, thanks.
Thank you.
Starting 4 minutes of prep time. All right, got 4 minutes if you're ready? Our judge? All right. I've got about 6 responses and then an impact to summarize why at the end of the day you should still be voting for the affirmative in today's resolution. Riley left out one part. He says that he's always right, and this is actually almost never the case. So let's keep that in mind as we move into this round. He talked about the resolutional analysis point of uncorruptible. You can tag my response to this as principle isn't corrupted. Again, that's principle isn't corrupted. When we're talking about intrinsic goods becoming being uncorruptible in that sense, what we can see is that extrinsic circumstances and extrinsic situational aspects of the acquisition of knowledge can occasionally be immoral. But what we're going to be seeing through some of my responses is that the principle or the act of acquiring knowledge is not an intrinsically bad thing, and it still remains an intrinsic good despite its extrinsic circumstances. He talked about the value of virtue. I'm not going to disagree with this, but you can tag my response as wisdom proves. Again, that's wisdom proves. I just want to use wisdom as a way to prove this resolution a little farther. It's my method or a way to prove that this resolution actually is true. I actually can't come up here and say the acquisition of knowledge is good because the acquisition of knowledge is good and expect you to circle affirmative on your ballot there. So wisdom is essentially the lens that I'm going to be adding onto virtue, so that way I can elaborate on this resolution a little bit more. He talked about the contention 1 of acquisition can harm virtue. He had a subpoint A of means not valuable, the process can do harm, an application of Tuskegee experiment, and an impact of process destroys virtue. You can tag my response to all of this as humanity corrupted. Again, that's humanity corrupted. If you really look at the Tuskegee experiments, what you can see is that none of that needed it to happen. In this example, humanity was corrupted. That didn't need to happen for the principle of, or for the knowledge to be acquired at all. Just because it did means that there was an extrinsic force that was kind of obscuring the principle of the acquisition of knowledge. That's kind of, an obscure distinction to make, but I hope that you see where I'm coming from. The principle of the acquisition of knowledge was not corrupted or immoral in that example. It was people that were immoral. That didn't need to happen for the knowledge to be acquired. The acquisition of knowledge was still good. Then gaining that knowledge was still good, despite the extrinsic circumstances. Engaging in the process of the acquisition of knowledge is intrinsically good. He talked about the idea of misunderstands definitions in response to my resolutional analysis point. But you can tag my response to this as nothing exists in a vacuum. Again, that's nothing exists in a vacuum. I brought up my own definition of intrinsic. It means belonging to the essential nature or constitution of a thing. So what we have to see in this example is that goodness has to belong to the essential nature of the acquisition of knowledge, and the acquisition of knowledge has to belong to the essential nature of wisdom. Nothing can be put in a vacuum and still know it's good. There has to be some sort of way to measure its intrinsic goodness. So really this argument has no impact. He talked about the idea of intrinsic goods can have bad components. You can tag my response to this as love. Again, that's love. Love in and of itself cannot be made up of bad things. It's made up of things like compassion and hospitality. In the end, it's a big picture of which all those puzzle pieces are also intrinsically good. That's exactly what we see with wisdom. Being part of, being a puzzle piece of the bigger picture of an intrinsic good makes it an intrinsic good. So you can tag the impact of all of this as extrinsic circumstances don't disprove intrinsic good. Again, that's extrinsic circumstances don't disprove intrinsic good. That's a long tag, so I'm going to say it just one more time. Extrinsic circumstances don't disprove intrinsic good. So I hope that you see that through all of these responses, at the end of the day, you should still be voting for the one who's always right. Thanks.
Try and remain 1 minute and 59 seconds of prep time. Take a minute. I got 6 minutes left. Audience, judge. All right, let's go ahead and get started. All right, that last person made me kind of sad. I thought I was like, ooh, more people want to come watch me, and then they left. So I was like, no, I don't know. All right. One thing Joey also forgot to mention is that she lost our last debate that we had with each other. The last debate was actually in club when I asked her to homecoming, and I technically won that one, but she did lose that one because she was negative. So now I'll go ahead and get in some direct responses. Nothing can exist in a vacuum. Joey had brought this up, basically saying that nothing can exist in a vacuum, so she can't come up here and say the acquisition of knowledge is good because the acquisition of knowledge is good. And while I agree that's not what she's supposed to come up here and say, what she has to prove is that it's intrinsic to goodness, or basically that it is, it can't be corrupted and it's virtuous within itself. So my tag to that is virtue. Again, virtue. I explained this, I have the value of virtue. So she doesn't have to prove this absolutely in a vacuum, but she does have to prove that it is good within of itself, at least it's virtuous within of itself. If she comes up here and says, oh, but wisdom, well, that's not what she's trying to prove. She's trying to prove it to virtue. Virtue is the weighing mechanism that she's using. She's not saying it's good just because it's good. She's saying it's good because it's virtuous and can't be corrupted. Not being corrupted is the weighing mechanism. That's my second response, is can't be corrupted. Again, can't be corrupted. Those are the weighing mechanisms that Joey's ultimately having to use today in today's round. She brought up the response of the principle isn't corrupted. My response to this is not the principle. Again, not the principle. Then second, and then under this you can write down the act. Again, the act. We're not talking about whether or not the principle of the acquisition of knowledge is being corrupted. We're talking about if the actual actions can be corrupted. Because what's the definition of the acquisition? It's the act of getting or acquiring something. It's the act of achieving. So or the act of obtaining. So it doesn't matter whether or not the principle is corrupted. It matters if the actual actions can be corrupted and used for evil. That's what we're talking about. If she starts talking about, oh, the principle, well, that's outside the resolution. It's not what we're talking about. That's why I asked, is there a difference between acting upon something? Is there a difference between the ability to acquire something? The ability to acquire something is the principle behind it, and the actual acquisition is the actor process. And the actor process is what we're talking about. And the actor process has the ability to be corrupted, and that alone should warrant a negative ballot. Down, she talked about how wisdom proves virtue. Our response to this is prove uncorruptible. Again, prove uncorruptible. And then she talked about how humanity corrupted. She talked about how people are the immoral ones, and it's not the principle's fault. Again, you can tag this back into the same exact logic, Judge. The logic is that we're not talking about the principle, we're talking about the action itself. If the people misuse the action, but it's still the acquisition of knowledge, well, at that point, it's proved that it can be corruptible, it's proved that it's not an intrinsic good, but rather an instrumental good. And you can write that in big bold letters, instrumental good, and you can underline it with whatever you need to do to remember that, Judge. Because I'm not saying the acquisition of knowledge is bad. I think the acquisition of knowledge can be really good, and it can also be really bad, though. It's amoral. It's instrumentally good. We use it to achieve things. She talked about how, then my last couple points are 2 voting issues for you. My first one is framework wins. Again, framework wins. At the end of the day, I've won the framework debate because Joey has she has not refuted the idea of how we're not talking about this from the whole term. She dropped that point I had brought it up. So at the end of the day, the negative team has won the framework debate. And as soon as you look at this through the negative framework, it becomes clear that a negative ballot is warranted. Then my second voting issue is achieve virtue. Again, achieve virtue. We're not trying to achieve wisdom. We're not trying to achieve anything else. At the end of the day, all Joey has to prove is that the acquisition of knowledge within of itself is virtuous. And she can't do that. So it's for those reasons that I urge a negative ballot. Thank you.
Starting remain judge. I've got 2 responses and 2 voting issues to summarize why at the end of the day you should still be voting for the affirmative in today's round. He brought up the idea of not the principle, the act a lot. And I just want to, I have one response to this. You can tag it as justice. Again, that's justice. I talked about the idea of maybe using justice to exact revenge in cross-examination. He said that justice itself was not corrupted, that it was the intent with which you did it that was the immoral part. That's exactly what we see with things like the Tuskegee experiment and these inherently immoral processes. What we can see is that the act didn't have to be corrupted. It was humanity that was corrupted. The intent was corrupted. That doesn't disprove the intrinsic value of the acquisition of knowledge. You can use beauty to exact revenge. You can use justice to exact revenge. You can use beauty for lust, and intrinsic goods can be used for bad things with a malintent. But what we can see is that the intent doesn't disprove its intrinsic value. He talked about the idea of virtue, and that in response to my idea that nothing exists in a vacuum. You can tag my response to this as wisdom is virtuous. Again, that's wisdom is virtuous. I don't think that there's a whole lot of value clash when you break this resolution down to what we're actually talking about. Wisdom is virtuous, and I'm essentially proving that the acquisition of knowledge is inherently virtuous by proving that it's intrinsic to another virtuous thing. And I'm going to talk about that in one of my voting issues. But you can tag my first voting issue as extrinsics don't disprove. Again, that's extrinsics don't disprove. You can tag my subpoint A as humanity corrupted. Again, that's humanity corrupted. Let's revisit his example of the Tuskegee experiment. What we can see is that people didn't actually have to suffer as much as they did through the Tuskegee experiment for people to actually learn what they did about syphilis. This didn't have to happen. Humanity was corrupted in that example, as was their intent, which leads me to my subpoint B, which is intent corrupted. Again, that's intent corrupted. In the Tuskegee experiment, people's intent was corrupted. They agreed that it was okay to experiment on human beings. That was incorrect. But the process of acquiring that knowledge was still intrinsically good. We agreed in cross-examination that even though you can have a bad intent while doing something, that doesn't pervert its intrinsic goodness. We agreed on that about justice. You can tag my second voting issue as component of intrinsic good. Again, that's component of intrinsic good. You can tag my subpoint A as part of wisdom. Again, that's part of wisdom. My entire argumentation is summed up in the idea that when we're looking at the picture of wisdom, the acquisition of knowledge is a puzzle piece that upholds it. So you can tag my subpoint B as virtuous. Again, that's virtuous. At the end of the day, because the acquisition of knowledge is part of wisdom, it is inherently virtuous. Both the values have been upheld on my side of the resolution. Thanks.